And now onto our Sunshine Week presentation. Sunshine Week is a week to promote open government. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis once commented, "Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants." If that's true, we need a whole lot more sunshine right now in this world. Sunshine, not just of government, but those who are deciding how and what kind of information we consume. And that's what we're talking about tonight. Tonight's panelists not only think about these issues every day, but they're dedicated to educating anyone who will listen about the pandemic of misinformation. Nancy Watzman is one of those people. She's director of Links LLC in Denver, her own company that supports and educates news collaborations, partnerships, and others in combating mis- and disinformation. And I'm sure we'll get into that tonight. She's also a journalist who's written for Harper's Magazine, The Nation, and is co-author of Is That a Politician in Your Pocket? Nancy lives in Denver and is a dedicated friend of this organization. And I want to welcome her, and she will introduce all of our panelists tonight. Thank you. And welcome, Nancy.
Thanks, Nicole. And thanks, it was just great to see those awards being given out and seeing what CoLab has done in the first year. And before anything else, I want to repeat Nicole's pitch to consider a contribution to the Colorado Freedom of Information Coalition. They do such important work and we need them very much and they need support. So please consider making a contribution. So welcome to Truth Be Told, the proliferation of online misinformation and disinformation and what we can all do about it. It's really exciting. I know we had a lot of people signed up for tonight. I think it's a bit ironic that people are tuning in on YouTube, which is kind of one of these social media platforms we're going to be talking about. It kind of represents, I think, the dichotomy we sometimes have here where social media has brought us so much ability during the pandemic to still gather safely, but also presents us with these problems. So we've all seen the spread, what it can do, the spread of online and mis and disinformation. I think what leaps to mind for most Americans is what happened on January 6th in the nation's capital. But here in Colorado, we've seen plenty of manifestations of the harm it could be. There's been public officials doxxed, journalists doxxed and threatened. We've seen a locally based company, Dominion Voting Services, become the subject of a pretty bizarre conspiracy theory. We've seen a lot of innuendo around our voting systems, around COVID, around vaccines. You know, we've just seen a lot of stuff right here in Colorado. But the kinds of problems we're facing, I mean, this isn't the first time that new technologies in communications have presented problems. And if you go back to 1961, Newt Minow, who's the FCC chairman, then famously said that, you know, he was calling TV, which was the brand new technology then, he called it a vast wasteland. And the speech where he said that was actually considered one of the crucial points before public media was created, where Laura Frank, who spoke earlier, made her career at Rocky Mountain PBS most recently before CoLab. So we also have, I think, a time of opportunity, and there's a lot of solutions out there. I'm hoping we're going to get into all of this, both the problem and some of the solutions that are out there. I kind of put them into 5 basic buckets, but there are probably more and lots of many buckets. There is the idea of antitrust, breaking up these large companies like Google and Facebook that have become, so ever present in our lives, and some say control maybe too much. There's pushes to regulate platforms here in Colorado. There's a bill right now in the legislature by Carrie Donovan that proposes a commission. It's been pretty controversial, I'd say, but about regulating digital communications. There's litigation. There's some folks who are going to court, like Dominion Voting Systems, who are going to court and trying to bring libel suits against those that have posted false content about them and so forth. There's this idea of creating new public social media, kind of akin to public TV, public radio. And there's media literacy. We'll talk a lot about that tonight. What kinds of new skills and strategies do we need in the era of social media? So we have great speakers tonight. We're going to do short introductions, but we're hoping to preserve most of the time for conversation, your questions, which you can ask on YouTube. If you log into YouTube, you can put your questions in the chat there, and hoping to have some conversation between the panelists, not just, us talking to the screen individually. But before we get to that part, so we have three people here tonight. Alex Redder, who is right there in the mountains, as you can see, of Colorado. He is the former senior vice president of engineering at Twitter. He's a Colorado resident now, and he appears in the documentary Social Dilemma, which, if you haven't seen it, you might want to tune in. It goes into a lot of these issues that our social media platforms present. We also have Nora Benavides, who's the director of U.S. Free Expression Programs for PEN America. So she runs the misinformation and media literacy programs for PEN, and she's worked in Colorado with Colorado partners as well. And then we have Damaso Reyes, who's a journalist and a media literacy expert. And he's done some work in Colorado schools. So we try to bring together people that all have a stake in our state, not just this issue. And so we're going to start, though, with Alex to kind of set the scene. And so, Alex, if you haven't already, you might want to unmute. I think that, we're talking about the social dilemma. You make a cameo in the social dilemma, as I recall, right at the beginning. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to just kind of ask you, what makes social media different? What makes these challenges we face today different? And why is a Twitter post different from, say, a letter to the editor or an op-ed that someone sends to a newspaper?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm glad that this movie and other things and the tragic things we're seeing in society are spurring this conversation, because that ultimately is an early step, but a necessary step in solving the problem. So thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. It's different in a couple of ways. The first one, I should say, it's not fundamentally different. There's always been the ability to share thoughts, true or not, with other people. What is different is the scale and the power of the tool. So you had an example of writing a letter to the editor. I can write a letter to an editor to a newspaper, but if a bunch of people read it and it's especially salacious or controversial and it wires people up, it doesn't automatically copy itself overnight to all the other newspapers. So suddenly everyone is reading it everywhere. But that's what social media does. I can post something and it can, the phrase is, it can go viral. It can appear, it can grow in this unbounded exponential way that is very much like how viruses reproduce. That's why it was given that name. That doesn't happen. That, the analog world and the newspaper world and the television world have this natural attenuation. Things can't copy and go viral. So there's that. There's also the fact that even if it doesn't go viral, the scale of these platforms is so massive. The fact, Mark Zuckerberg can write something and 2 billion people will see it. That is, a third of the population of the whole earth. That's unlike any other microphone that exists on the planet. That's unprecedented, and it rises all these behaviors that don't exist at a smaller scale. I think the other thing that's different is being able to hide behind anonymity. There are social graces and cues and things that prevent me from, as I'm walking around in society and people see, people know my name and they see my face, that is a moderator, I suppose, some days between how I behave. When you're anonymous, that completely goes away. And I think that's to be, and you've seen this, there are experiments of it. There have been social networks that have been 100% anonymous. They've all fallen apart now, to my knowledge. And if you think Twitter is a dark and hateful place, go look at the history of these anonymous social networks. It's absolutely terrifying, the sort of stuff that will surface when everyone is completely anonymous and behind a keyboard. So those things, the anonymity, the ability to go viral, do make it fundamentally different. And we're seeing these derivative behaviors and consequences that don't exist in a more analog world when real names are attached.
Yeah. So what do you think, how did this happen? I guess, you worked at Twitter. How did was this something that folks were aware of there as it was developing, or tell us a little bit about that.
So Twitter is interesting. A lot of startups are this way. It's very hard to predict at the beginning. So most startups fail, I should say, 90% of them, 95% of them, 98% of them, depending on how you count. A lot of what Twitter became was not part of a master plan. And that's because there was no master plan. We wanted to connect people. We built a simple product. Even the basic building blocks of the product were things that users invented. I mean, things that you think of now as integral to the product: retweeting, liking, quote tweeting, following. Those were all, well, not following, that was core to the product, but certainly retweeting was a thing that a user invented, and Twitter just took it over once they saw everyone trying to hack it in and there was no way to do it in the product. And then they invented a native retweet button. So this was not intentional. It would have been very hard to predict what would happen when there's this public communication forum that has hundreds of millions of people on it. Over time, people were more aware of it. I will say though, working in that company, like any company, everyone has opted into working there and everyone drinks the Kool-Aid, and they're not bad people. They're not disingenuous people, but you believe the Kool-Aid when you work somewhere and you retell the stories and the lore and the rituals and the culture of working in any organization. And so it was hard to see the downsides when you were in the building. And for me, at least, I mean, one, I should say, I haven't worked there for 5 years. During that time, I think the problem has gotten worse. And also, I'm not in the building anymore, so I'm able to see it with a more clear, unbiased perspective. But the downsides were over there, and there are tons of stories of Twitter being really powerful. I mean, the Arab Spring was the example we used a lot, connecting people that are lonely and live in a town where they think no one is like them, and the power of connecting those people, the magical, the more fun, lighthearted moments where you see like two celebrities telling, jokes about each other, but in public. So it's like a private conversation between famous people, but everyone can watch. So there are really powerful examples, but that was the lore of the company. That was everything that's told. I think there is a, not intentional, but a blind spot around the increasingly dark side of these platforms.
What did you find the most troubling? I mean, you said you haven't been there for the last 5 years and you think things have maybe gotten a little worse. I mean, how do you think we got to this juncture?
I think there were a couple like cultural norms there that were just overplayed and became very one-sided. So one is this blind adherence to this libertarian ideal of, regulation is bad, internet companies should just regulate themselves. Free speech is always a good thing. That was very much the ethos of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is a big place, so that's painting with a broad brush, but there's a lot of that, this like techno-libertarian point of view. And also, the pace of the trust and safety team there. This is a problem. This is a very hard problem to solve. You can't solve it perfectly, but at the end of the day, these are companies worth tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. And if they wanted to tackle this problem seriously, they could make a real dent. And so there just wasn't, I never saw a serious investment in this space. And in fact, was often pushed back on about, what is appropriate to do, what is not appropriate to do. And this is really, the common argument is that, of the form, making the perfect the enemy of good. Any system you propose to tackle this problem, you can come up with some counterexample where that system breaks down. And that's true. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything. That means you should actually try to tackle the problem and you realize you're not going to solve it perfectly. So there was this real ethos of, once we go down this road, it's going to have unintended consequences. It's going to be hard to solve perfectly. So very much have a hands-off, we don't touch the content at all. We're not responsible for the consequences of the content. And I found that troubling and increasingly troubling over time.
Right. So where do you think it, kind of when thinking about all those kinds of proposals, what are you most interested in?
Yeah, so I think it's pretty clear that companies, when there is something that is either good or in the short term, at least good for business, but creates an externality to society, companies can't moderate themselves. I mean, the most recent example of this is Facebook's commission that supposedly moderates itself. I think that is the fox guarding the hen house. And, you don't have to look too far back in history to see a bunch of examples where that is where it's appropriate for society to step in, right? Cigarette companies never decided that it probably wasn't good for people to make advertisements targeting children, right? That was society that decided that wasn't in the company's interest, so they had to regulate it there. Same thing with companies, dumping chemicals in a river and it just washing downstream, or the creation of OSHA with labor safety, or increasingly now, not so much in this country, but certainly in other countries, this realization that, there needs to be external regulation around the effects of carbon in the atmosphere, because oil and gas companies aren't going to wake up one day and deal with it just out of the goodness of their hearts. They're going to deal with it if they're forced to deal with it, or if there's some economic incentive to deal with it. So I think there are a bunch of areas there where we could address that. I think we could get a lot smarter around when is anonymity appropriate. And to be clear, there are a lot of cases when it's actually really appropriate. I mean, a perfect example, a political dissident in a country where there is no free speech, right? You actually really want to be able to report what's going on the ground and not have fear of being arrested or executed by the government. But that doesn't mean it's always appropriate, and it doesn't mean there are no downsides. So I think there's some things we could explore there. There are also, as I think you mentioned earlier, digital literacy is really important. If you think about what we, I happen to be a parent. I'm sure many people in this call are parents. We think about what we try to instill in our children. It's like a critical mind and the ability to reason about things. And so they know themselves, like, right, I shouldn't make strangers online. I shouldn't accept candy from kids in the playground. And this world that people are growing up in now, and we're in now, you're overwhelmingly surrounded by devices and social media and notifications and these tricks of the attention economy. And we need to educate people. And you're not given tools for how to deal with that. Certainly not in school and not in adult life. And I think we're seeing the consequences of people that grew up in one world and are now living in a world that's pretty different from the one they grew up in. So I'm sure there are ways we can educate. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but really bring digital literacy so people are somewhat inoculated to all the traps that you can fall into in this world.
Right, and that's actually a really great segue for Nora. Nora comes to us again from PEN America. And, it's right there in your job title that, free expression, right? And so one of the things you hear a lot when people start to talk about having regulation of social media is, but we have free speech in this country. So I'm just kind of curious to hear, well, how has your approach to this maybe changed or not changed, now that you're working on these issues of misinformation, and what do we need to be really careful about? What are the downsides if we start to try to tackle these problems in certain ways?
Well, thanks so much, Nancy. It's great to be here. I want to start by, I was really digesting everything that Alex said, and I just want to sort of like take a moment, and the entire program has been so inspiring. I very strongly believe in the Sunshine Week and in freedom of information. So it just is wonderful to be here. I think that talking about misinformation in the context of something like Sunshine Week is so critical because it really moves away from talking about just the content itself and instead focuses on how we come to things. What are our practices and how can we access things? I'm a lawyer by training. And when I started as a lawyer, I was a First Amendment lawyer focused on the real world, if you will, like things that were happening, protests and journalists having access to legislative hearings. And it really wasn't until I was along in my career, I started kind of seeing what worried me online, and that the level of vitriol, the kind of hate that we were seeing, to Alex's point about anonymity, the kind of lack of inhibitions that people started exhibiting, and that when online, anonymous or not, we are all less inhibited to say things that you would never say to another person face to face. And I was just sort of concerned. And I think, anyone who's been in this space for some time has seen for many years where this was headed. That, the internet was a beautiful and exciting place. And I just want to go back to what the 90s were like, because we do forget that if I remember the idea of a blog post and how a blog would be this exciting place for people to connect, things have really, really changed. And the proliferation now of just content, creation of content, accessibility of content, and people having wild opinions that they feel excited and eager to voice has led us all to voice our opinions and access other people's opinions, often then sparking more confrontation online. And so we get to this moment where I think we are more divided than, frankly, we've ever been. And yet people are often quite siloed. We gravitate to information and news we enjoy. We really kind of seek out what we like. If Nancy says something, let's say we know each other and she says something I like, it makes me feel good. So I kind of gravitate to the things she says. I see her as a source. And so in my work as, kind of protecting the First Amendment and thinking about how we make an internet that's healthy, The question still remains, in my view, how do we do that with the most expression? How can we create a situation and a real ecosystem where people feel like they can go online, they can engage with each other, but that they're doing it in a way where we're stimulating and we're trying to kind of be curious. Unfortunately, we are just so emotional now when we react to what we see online. And that's, I think, all predicated on how social media was created around our likes and our dislikes, that we essentially rank what we like. And by doing that, we tie everything we do online to that emotional response. And, it's a fascinating thing to sort of see now efforts to think about solutions, because from a First Amendment perspective, I always try to caution that the solutions around regulation or the questions of, is this a First Amendment violation? Platforms are private companies. They have every right to do what they choose in removing content. That doesn't mean that they should not embody a spirit of safety, a kind of culture where people can come and feel like they not only can listen, but they can be heard. And so I absolutely agree that, to Alex's kind of allusion and mention of trust and safety, that those are the kinds of principles that got downgraded for the salacious headlines that people gravitate to. And because social media platforms thrive on things like disinformation and misinformation, it becomes a culture where the sexiest and most offensive content is the stuff that gets upgraded, engaged, liked, shared. And that's a climate that thrives on emotionality and usually negative emotionality. So in my view, the nexus between what we're doing online and how we maintain a free space for people to access things is deeply embedded with how we're actually interacting with each other.
Right. And so, when you find yourself in that situation, getting away from the heady and back to, kind of what your experience is, any given person online every day, and you see, you have this relative and they're posting a conspiracy theory. How do you, I know you guys have done some thinking about the best way to approach people in that situation. What would you guys recommend?
It's the most common question I get from everyone from every walk of life, it seems like. And to give you, just for people listening tonight, some background, we at PEN America have been researching disinformation and its effect on society for several years, since the 2016 election. And it isn't that we monitor, thousands of Twitter posts. We're really kind of looking at how misleading narratives are sowing discord, how they really divide us, how we often can't come together to agree on shared principles. And a lot of that is tied to our distrust of the news. And so one of our core solutions is we need to kind of empower people who are online to make sense of what they see. And so in our media literacy work, the number one question people always ask is, well, what do I do if there's that crazy uncle? What do I do when someone else is sharing something? And at the risk of saying the thing that everyone hates, I think there's a level of empathy we have to bring. We are in a culture where we call people out. Everything around the kind of cancel culture of, deplatforming, getting rid of people, really kind of moves us forward, kind of leans into that. And I often say, how do you call someone in? How do you actually ask them about their values? Ask them about where they got a piece of content, like a news article, or did they look at where that image came from, if they've shared something that seems questionable. But when you open up space for people to talk about that, it's not confrontational and it's not trying to convince someone of truth. Because when you try to start a conversation with someone who believes something very different, and you say, well, I know the facts. I looked at this scientific journal and your science about COVID is wrong. That absolutely is the worst place to start, because what will people do? They'll be defensive. They'll probably not want to engage with you. They also won't believe you. So no amount of, banging your head against the wall will open up a kind of opportunity to engage the way people who are really media literate are thinking about, what is the source of what someone shared? Like, tell me about what you felt when you shared that. And when people really just won't kind of digest or listen to you at all, I often say, think about how you just be a resource. Be here, be available to people. It's not going to solve everything. And I have a lot of ideas about solutions, but it is one of the elements. And that part of what we have to do is find ways to talk with each other, to, say, Nancy, like, listen, I saw that you shared something. I'm sending you a private message now, and I just want to learn more about why you shared that. It's not calling her out. It's really kind of bringing her in. And of course, given how our algorithms work, though we know very little, I often try to dissuade people from really publicly shaming someone on social media. Because when you comment or share or repost something, all it does is give it more oxygen for other users to see it. And so it feeds the beast. And part of what we want to do is flood the zone with fun, credible information, and then really kind of begin having conversation with people in more intimate settings.
Yeah, I've definitely tried to use that technique myself sometimes where, you just try not to, you see something, it's like, you send a private message. Do you know what that is? Or are you, or what do you think? And sometimes it could be, people are often relieved, I find, to sometimes not, but.
It's horribly embarrassing. I mean, I think it's important to note that in all of this, I'm an expert and I still fall for mis and disinformation. I think we kind of need to, and certainly experts need to explain that we're all vulnerable. And in moments where you're, let's say, lying in bed, right, doom scrolling, you're probably more vulnerable than when I'm in work mode thinking about mis and disinformation. So, when we kind of open that up as well, I think it makes people feel like they have permission to say, oh, well, how could I start looking and feeling like, oh, I'm not going to take the bait? Like, what are the practices that would lead me to be better?
Right. Well, let's turn now to Damaso. And Damaso, thanks for being here. Maybe you could tell a little bit about how you came to this issue and your work with kids and others on literacy efforts, and what you think, what are the skills we need to make sure people have?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I think this is a wonderful forum and an opportunity. Hopefully the audience is learning as much as I've been learning as a panelist. My background is as a journalist. I've been a journalist for more than 20 years. And about 5 years ago, I started working in the media literacy space for a nonprofit called the News Literacy Project. And I actually began teaching media literacy in classrooms in New York City, and later on worked to train teachers and even journalists, as well as members of the public, in sort of how to be media literate, how to be information literate. And I think that, your question is very timely, because we really do need to be teaching the general public, certainly, but especially our young people, our students, in how to be literate in the social media age. It's a very different set of skills. And it's not just typing and swiping, but it's really a set of cognitive, critical thinking skills that when I was a 15 or 16-year-old, I actually didn't need, because I would, turn on the TV at 6:30 and see the evening news. And between the news segments, there were commercials. And after the news, there was Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune. And I never confused any of those things. They were all very, very clear as to what function they served in our society. And obviously today we have an information landscape which is incredibly muddied, and often muddied on purpose. If you turn on CNN, depending, or MSNBC or Fox News, depending on what time of day it is, you'll see a bunch of square, people in boxes, or people sitting at a big table and telling you what they think or how they feel, none of which is necessarily news. But if you're not trained to recognize that, then you won't be able to distinguish the difference between someone giving you some propaganda or someone trying to entertain you, which might happen if you're watching John Oliver or Trevor Noah, or someone giving you their opinion, or someone actually giving you the news. And so being able just to determine categories of information, right? That's now a basic survival skill that a lot of young people, and unfortunately a lot of adults, just don't have. So we really need to, I think, focus on kind of retraining ourselves to be literate in this sort of very specific way.
Yeah, one of the projects I work on this year is based at NYU. It's called Cybersecurity for Democracy. And I think one of the things that project's taught me, they come at these issues as cybersecurity specialists, right? And so they think of online platforms as being, where are the vulnerabilities and how can we fix them? And part of that is what I feel like we need to teach kids and others is that social media, how it works, like the actual workings of how news travels and how you came to see something and what the source is. Which is really different from like what you say, like when you turn on the TV and you know exactly what you're seeing, or you open the newspaper and you know exactly who wrote it. It's so much part and parcel of the experience. Anyway, but so what gives you hope for the future, Damas? What have you seen? You've been in the classrooms. Tell us what's good.
Yeah, what gives me hope is that media literacy education actually works. Like I've seen it firsthand. I've gone into a classroom in week 1 and kids can't tell the difference between historical footage of Dr. King and a scene from the movie Selma. And 6 or 7 weeks later, they are actually interrogating sources, and they're able to tell the difference between news and opinion, and they're getting into critical thinking. So is it perfect? Absolutely not. Do we have a long way to go in the media literacy education space? Absolutely. But, there are so many parallels with mis and disinformation, and public health. And there's a reason why we call them viral rumors. And, as we see with the coronavirus, we worked really fast and we created these vaccines, which are very effective, but we're going to have to keep working on them, and we're going to have to keep tracking their efficacy. I think the same approach is very much with media literacy. And just the short time I've been in the field, we've evolved so much in sort of what we emphasize and how we teach it and how we reach young people. But I can say firsthand that education works, whether it's with young people or older people. It is. We actually have a solution to at least part of this problem. When you talk about, you mentioned, looking at social media through a cybersecurity lens, the biggest cybersecurity vulnerability is right here, right? Misinformation can't go viral. It can't propagate without us, right? So just as if we're vaccinated, right, coronavirus or any other virus has a much harder time propagating. If we are educated and we are media literate, misinformation has a much, much harder time propagating.
Right. And I think maybe part of that is learning, again, how social media works because there's so much great research about how our brains react when we see emotional content online, or we have an option. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever I do presentations, especially for teachers, and it always kind of blows my mind, I always have a slide that, has the words confirmation bias on it. And I ask these teachers, many of whom have master's degrees and advanced degrees, who here knows what this term means. And usually it's 1 or 2 if I'm lucky. So just this idea that we have, we all have biases, and that things on social media, whether intentionally or not, can trigger those biases, but we are inclined to believe things that support or reinforce what we already believe. And we're inclined to distrust or reject things that challenge what we believe. This is an innate, whether you're highly educated or poorly educated, we all have this tendency. But if you're not aware of that, then you become a target, right? If I'm a Tesla or a Prius driving vegan, there are people out there who are saying, all right, I'm going to create this piece of misinformation to appeal to this person or this type of person. And so I see it, it reinforces my worldview. And then I just nod. I don't question where it came from. I don't question the source. I don't question how it makes me feel. It reinforces what I already feel. So without that sort of inner knowledge or that ability to be self-reflective and being trained in being self-reflective, we become targets, and we become oftentimes, most of the time, unintentional vectors for misinformation.
Right. And actually, now I would like to turn, we're already getting some great questions in, and I'm hoping we can turn to some conversation about these questions. A lot of them are drawing on stuff that you guys have been saying. So, there's a couple on this theme that, we talked earlier on about, how people can hide behind social media, you can be anonymous. And then Nora, you talked about how sometimes, if you want to, combat misinformation, it's best not to shame someone. So a couple of people asked the interesting question about but isn't shaming or pointing out when someone does something, kind of bad online, one of the main ways you can stop it, which is, so that's an interesting question, I think. What do you think?
I'm happy to start, but I want to hear what Damaso has to say as well. And I would say I don't think calling people out publicly is really ever constructive. I have only ever seen it become a kind of breeding ground for more people to jump in to essentially fight. So we'll just take this conversation here. Let's say that Nancy, you're going to be, of course, the subject for everything here, but Nancy posts something and I think it's problematic. She posted on Facebook. And, I make sure to take time to fact check it myself, which is great, right? Look, see, Damaso's like, great. And then I comment saying, why'd you post this? This is clearly fake news. Well, then maybe Damaso may not have actually seen Nancy's post before, but we're all friends. And my comment probably boosted the engagement for his feed. And then, of course, what's he going to do? I would guess, right? I'm making myself the most smart one here, which is horrible, I suppose. I'm realizing as I do it. But Damaso might not read the article, might not read my comment, might not take the time to fact check any of it, might make assumptions. He might also do all of those other wonderful things.
Guy, right? That's the kind of guy he is.
Look at kind of shady, And so because of all of that, what's going to happen? I would speculate, let's just for the sake of the experiment, say he then comments and says, this is why I hate XYZ people. They think this and da, 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 da. And then Alex is just hanging out in the mountains and, probably wouldn't have seen any of this, likes Nancy, never sees her posts, thinks whatever of Nora, but really loves Damaso's point of view all the time. So suddenly he sees this post. See, we're all engaged here. And what's he going to do? He's going to clearly respond, but he probably won't have read my comments. He might have only read Damaso's. By the time it gets to the point where 30 people or 7 people have seen and commented, you're not usually going to go through and digest all of it. So you kind of get these snippets of different people's views. And I don't actually think any of that ever gets to the question ultimately of how could we actually engage with Nancy to get her to the point where she questions what she saw, what she shared. So in the most simplistic way, I often say all of us should pause before we share, literally just breathe. That's the most simple request. But I also then think that the idea of calling people out online just will make more people see it. And it never gets to sort of the root behavior. So much of that cognitive training that Damaso spoke about.
What if the person who's posting originally is me, but I happen to be, I'm just out to make trouble. I am doing it deliberately. It's not, I want to do this. I think we can think of some people that we know very well who have done this recently. You do this, and it's not just the person we're all thinking about. There's plenty of people.
Wasn't me.
So what about that? I mean, Damaso, do you want to?
Yeah, it's complicated, right? If this stuff were easy, we'd either be really rich like Alex, or we'd, because he worked for Twitter, or probably wouldn't be we're having this conversation. I think a lot of it's contextual, right? If Nora knows Nancy, then a DM or a private message is probably the best way to go. If Nora doesn't really know Nancy, or her DMs aren't open, then what's really interesting is that sometimes putting in a fact check is a way in which, like, I, as a media literacy educator, I tell people, well, you see something on Twitter or Instagram, actually read some of the comments, because sometimes somebody will post a fact check, and then, like, essentially Nora has done your work for you. But it's contextual, right? Because if you are dealing with a troll, then you kind of have to decide, well, do I want to engage with this person? Do I want to elevate them? Is anyone actually paying any attention to this at all? And if I comment, then am I, as Nora mentioned, am I raising it up? So, definitely take a breath, take some time, and then think about what the right approach is, because there is this contextual thing, like, generally speaking, let's not engage with trolls, right? Because that's their goal, is whether it's positive or negative, they want you to engage with them. So you kind of have to read into it a little bit and use your best judgment. But if you are going to post if you are going to post a fact check or dispute someone's claim, whether it's a friend or whether it's anonymous or whether it's troll, it's really important to be respectful and to use as neutral language, as neutral a term as you can, because you don't want to add, fuel to the fire. So say, hey, I'm not sure that that's correct. Have you seen this evidence? Or, hey, how do you know that's to be true? Because I found this over here. Can you shed some light on it, right? Try to, like, not antagonize the other person, whether they're someone you know or someone who you just happen to see on social media.
I am probably, of the three of us, the least close to being an expert in this particular question. But I will say, for the troll case, it's obvious. It's like, you should always never feed trolls. You should always ignore trolls. Most people are not trolls. Trolls get a lot of attention because they're so objectionable to most of us, but most people are not trolls. But everything I've read from psychologists and behavioral scientists will say that calling people out not only does it not work, it actually achieves the opposite. It just makes people dig their heels in. And there's I just finished the book Think Again by Adam Grant, which just came out, who does study this stuff. And he talks a lot about this and cites a bunch of people that have studied this in particular. But he had one piece of practical advice, which I thought was pretty interesting, which is, when someone is arguing for something, don't immediately argue against them, even if you're 100% convinced you're right. And even if you are, it's not going to work. But ask more like how questions, like, how will that work? And make them explain it, so you pick a relatively, I suppose, what used to be a political debate, but now seems so benign, it's not a political debate. Pick someone that's like arguing for a flat tax, for example. So instead of arguing, oh, you're so stupid, it should be regressive or progressive or whatever, you just ask, like, walk me through how that would work. Explain how everything would work, everything from having ample budget to how you would collect it and blah, blah, blah. And asking how makes people think more critically about their own ideas instead of you just attacking them, which they're not really going to listen, and they're probably just going to dig their heels in. And again, this is not my area of expertise. This is just, I try to read on this subject to learn about it. And that seems to be a consensus from some of the smartest people that I've read on this topic.
Right. And I mean, look, we've also just been through a period where, I think we're talking about these kinds of situations you encounter every day and so on, and are, often benign in how they kind of emerge. But we did have platforms platform a bunch of, the former president of the United States, a bunch of, right-wing, militia groups, things like that. So it does get really complicated. When is it? I don't know, Alex, do you want to speak to that at all? I'm sorry, but you are the representative from Twitter.
Sure. That's true. All those things have happened. I mean, it's easy to criticize Twitter from the outside, which now I am. I do think it's very hard to figure out who to deplatform and not deplatform. I think the irony is that it's now the case that the right in this country believes that these platforms are very liberally biased. But actually, I think there's a lot of evidence that also shows that probably the rise of these platforms was extremely helpful to exactly the side of the aisle, the right, that is now accusing them of bias on the other side. So it's very complicated. But one thing, without opining too much on what exactly the right side of people to kick out or not kick out are, the past few months haven't been a fully controlled experiment because a lot of things have changed, but it is remarkable to see the difference in the country by removing one person from a couple, the unelected CEOs of a couple companies made one decision and removed one person from one customer from their product. And I feel like it's substantially changed the tenor of conversation and the temperature and the news cycle. And that's scary to me that two people, Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg, have that power to change how the whole country reacts and what's reported in major news outlets and left-leaning ones and right-leaning ones and everything, just by kicking two people off their platform. I mean, that's terrifying. And I think it speaks to how massively powerful these networks are.
Yeah, it's complicated. We have a lot more questions, so I want to get to some of them. So a couple of people were commenting on the conversation we just had, still, wondering, but when is it appropriate to put a link to a fact check? And isn't it important for other people to see someone who's posting something that's false be called out? So if you do it all privately, how are other people going to even be able to see that there's a problem with this?
Well, I think hopefully, and I've certainly had this happen, the person who posted the thing will take it down, right? So then it will get less oxygen. I think I wouldn't feed trolls. Let's just kind of agree to that in general. But I think it's okay to post fact checks or post information which, may clarify something if you do it in a respectful way. It's just like, I think when we're on social media, imagine, I want to tell everybody, imagine you were at a party and you were actually talking to this person. Would you write, "You stupid idiot, I can't believe you, fill in the blank expletive," that you would post that? No, you wouldn't. You might turn your head and be like, "Really?" Like, I don't think that's true. What about this, right? You might actually engage with the person. And I think, unfortunately, social media, whether we're anonymous or not, does have this disinhibiting effect on us, right? And that's partially because social media is very new and we're still, as a society, trying to figure out, essentially how to behave on social media. And many of us are still trying to figure out how to behave on social media. But I think it's okay to post correct information, or at least as correct as you know it. But how you do it, how you engage with these people is incredibly important, right? It's the difference between being heard and not being heard, either by that person or other people. Making someone feel defensive versus, it's one thing if I'm at a party and I, say, "Hey, your fly's down." It's another thing if I shout at the top of my lungs, "Oh, look at this stupid idiot. He can't zip his." So the approach we take, I think, is incredibly important, whether it's a fact check or anything else we do on social media.
Right. I mean, I guess what would you guys think? I'm thinking about, I have a teenage son who was on debate team. And it feels like a lot of people approach or think that they're, should be approaching this like you're on a debate and you're trying to win a debate. But maybe what you guys are saying is on social media, because of the way it works, it's not real. Some of those instincts that at least some of us older people have maybe about how you win and you fight and you are logical doesn't always work in getting. Is that kind of what you're saying, or is that not?
Well,
in debate club, you get a trophy, right? Like, on the internet, you don't get any trophies for winning a debate.
One thing I liked, Nancy, about one of the questions, however you phrased it, was, isn't it ever good to call someone out so other people can see it? Right. And I think it's, I totally agree with everything Damaso has said. You're likely not going to win people over the first several times you talk with them about an issue where they disagree. And in fact, I think winning or moving someone to your point of view should not be the goal of when you share, whether it's your own fact-checking experience or resources on how to do things like that, media literacy tips. The goal, if you are sharing publicly, could be to provide that for any number of other people. And I always say to people that truth takes time. It takes a long time to unpack, and like even a single piece of, let's say, image or video or headline, it takes time to even by myself fact check something. It takes time to get to the point where you're using those types of practices all the time. And it really can be hard to like unravel larger misleading narratives. So I think when we imagine the confrontation, imagining it more as sort of like for the others in the forum to be able to see useful tips is a more constructive way of viewing how you begin something, because you likely will not, and I have not, changed someone's opinion in a single encounter. You know, it can take time. And I do often think the way you do it, as Damaso said, is critical. And there are people in my life that I know it has taken years to slowly bring them back from fringe beliefs, conspiracy theories. I mean, years of time of really talking with people, bringing them in.
So here's, there are two questions that are in that I think are related to each other. You know, one is commenting that some of the things we're talking about, you know, seem like they might work at the micro level, but not at the macro level. And then there's another question for Alex, and this is also dear to my heart because it's, again, the project I'm working on is thinking about these issues. You know, what can the platforms do from a technology perspective, design perspective, to reduce the spread? So in other words, you know, we're talking a lot about human to human, which is, you know, the core of how social media works, but we're humans working in this technological framework that's artificial. So what should platforms do? Are they willing to do it? You know, how, you know, I've certainly seen a lot of things written about how, because of the way the profit motive of how it's set up within social media to profit from that kind of engagement, there's not necessarily a lot of incentive to change.
Someone else want to take the macro micro thing, and I'll jump in for the second part, or you tell me.
Yeah, well, and Damaso, do you want to talk about the micro? You know,
yeah. I mean, ultimately, you know, that's what social media is, right? It's a bunch of individual connections, and then, you know, occasionally something goes viral. But the truth is, when we're talking about trying to stop the spread of whether it's misinformation or coronavirus, right? Like if we all were washing our hands and wearing masks and socially distancing, you know, we probably wouldn't have had as many deaths as we did, right? Like individual actions do multiply. And so I think that that's part of what we're talking about. It's also this idea that, and this is a big shift in how we have seen media, at least within my lifetime, and I'm not that old, although I'm a lot older than I used to be. It used to be that media came to us and we consumed it, and that was it. Maybe we could write a letter to the editor, or maybe we could call into the, I remember doing this as a kid, calling into a radio station and asking them to play a song that I wanted to hear that I did not own. Now we have Spotify, right? Now we have Twitter. Now we have social media. We're all publishers now. So we have to interact with information and with media and social media in a much different way, which basically means that we have to be more engaged, we have to be more critical, but we also have to take a lot more ownership, right? One of the things that I always say about when people ask me, well, what should the platforms do? I say the platforms should do a lot. They should be a lot more engaged. There should be a lot more oversight internally within the platforms, but I don't trust Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey to keep me safe. I just don't. I don't think they have my Damaso Reyes' best interests at heart, no matter what they say in front of the few times a year they have to be in front of Congress. I can keep me safe, and I know that I have the tools and the cognitive ability essentially to be vaccinated against misinformation, not to absolve them of the important role that they can play in stopping disinformation and increasing the amount of civility on their platforms. But ultimately, we need to understand that in this new age of social media, which is very empowering, that empowerment we actually do have to take control of. And it makes the world a lot less scary when I know I can do a lot to keep myself safe, rather than depending on some CEO who's trying to decide, well, you know, we get a lot of engagement on this, you know, this hate speech stuff. Let's just see where it goes, versus me being like, hey, that's hate speech. I'm not going to retweet that. Or this is a problematic piece of propaganda. I'm not going to share that or like that. But it's not easy. That doesn't mean that it's easy or it's simple, right?
Right, and we do all live within these systems. Like we can control how we can control ourselves and our relationships with others. But if you choose to use these social media platforms, again, they operate in certain ways that we can't individually control, right? Or can we? I don't know, Alex. Do you?
Well, we can control how we interact with them, right? And which ultimately does impact. And I'll let Alex talk about this more, or Nora. It does begin to change how they think and how they operate.
So, so I think the point you made, Damaso, is correct. I think what's interesting is to understand what the companies are trying to do and why, and then we can talk about what they can do and what's possible and what's not possible, what their incentives are. So first, I should say Twitter doesn't even have a point. As absurd as this is to say, they don't even have a strong point of view on misinformation and disinformation versus truthful information. It's just an unintended consequence. In the exact same way that, oil and gas companies didn't have a strong point of view on like, hey, it's really cold, let's throw more carbon in the atmosphere to warm up. They were trying to do something totally different. They were trying to distribute energy cheaply and efficiently to lots of human beings. It just so happens the best way to do that is hydrocarbons, which has this consequence. But they're not optimizing for atmospheric CO2 or optimizing to trying to reduce it. They just don't care. It's just totally orthogonal to the thing they're trying to do, which is sell cheap energy to people. And that's a noble cause. Like access to energy is correlated with all kinds of great outcomes and development. And that's what they were trying to do. It just had this side effect. It's the same thing with Twitter. What Twitter is trying to optimize for, and Facebook, is engagement and retention of users. These companies would not be valuable if people used them once and they went away, or if fewer people use them. And it's a quirk of human nature that disinformation and misinformation is more engaging than, plain boring old facts. But you could imagine if human beings were different. I mean, let's say we were all, very logical aliens or robots or some other species, and we just loved engaging with encyclopedia articles. Well, then Twitter, with no change at all, would have encyclopedia articles going viral all the time. It's just, that's not how human beings are wired. For whatever reason, for whatever evolutionary reason, we're wired to really engage in this salacious stuff. And you see that outside of social media too. I mean, that's true. It's been a while, but from what I remember of like a middle school cafeteria, right? The crazy rumors about people gets all over the place. Just a random fact from chemistry class does not. And that just has to do with us as human beings. So they're optimizing for engagement. You asked what they could do instead. They could optimize for something else. So there are plenty of measures. You can go write software that tries to predict the veracity or the authoritativeness of certain content sources. And there are a bunch of problems with that. It's not perfect. But at the end of the day, Google is very good at doing this. And if you search for cancer, there's a reason that WebMD pops up first and not, Alex's medical blog that I just invented, right? I mean, you can come up with an imperfect, but still directionally correct quality score for content that has nothing to do with how much traffic Alex's medical blog is getting. So there are all sorts of things you could do if you decided to optimize for that. But their user growth is optimized for engagement. It turns out products you use all the time, by definition, you use a lot. So you come back to them. The products that you don't use very much, you end to churn out and eventually you stop using. It's sort of a tautology to say it. And so that's why they're optimizing for engagement, because they need people to use their product. And then on the business side as well, they're paid by engagement. So the way these advertising systems work is they get paid. An advertiser advertises on Twitter because they want some actual outcome that makes it money. So for example, I end up clicking through and buying whatever the product is they're selling. That's pretty hard to measure and attribute, though the companies spend a bunch of money doing that. So a proxy for that is engaging. If I see an ad and I ignore it versus I see an ad and I play the video embedded in the tweet, or I click on it and go to the website, those are all proxies for the valuable thing to the advertiser. And Twitter literally charges advertisers only when that happens. So if you're charging people for engagement and your revenue is correlated to engagement, of course, you're writing an algorithm that optimizes for engagement. But you could certainly do that differently. You made another point, Nancy, which is a common point that I've heard, but it's not clear to me that it's correct. This point that, isn't it better for business to allow all this to happen? And in the short term, certainly yes. I think that if you stopped optimizing for engagement, it would hurt the current business model. But at the same time, you probably know them. There are a lot of people that have quit these platforms because they're so toxic. From time to time, there was one recently, they're pretty large scale advertiser boycotts because these platforms are so toxic. So actually my personal belief is you could build a very healthy business, actually a stronger business with a more committed, safer feeling set of users by being really, really strict on this. It would take a while, and I don't think you would get results within 1 quarter, which is the timeline on which public companies report earnings. But it's not clear to me that this stance helps Twitter. And in fact, I can think of many anecdotal examples where it actually hurts the company.
That's really interesting perspective for sure. Just getting back.
I had one thing, Nancy.
Sure.
I love Alex's answer. It was such an engineering answer. I'm listening and I'm just like, in my own mind, I create typologies, of like what the platforms are doing, what they can do. And I think if we're kind of moving this conversation towards regulation, which it feels like we're moving slowly there, kind of going through like the human aspect and the micro, and then like, what are the platforms doing, what they can do, several years ago, Facebook came out with this announcement that it can basically remove, reduce, or inform users. And that's kind of the trope that all of the various platforms use. Of course, they can remove content, remove accounts. We've seen this over the last several months. They can downgrade or reduce the visibility of content or someone's posts in particular, or they can put something like a label or a moment of friction for people to inform them of what's happening online. When removal happens, my biggest concern is like massive sweeps of removal, when legitimate accounts get removed, legitimate speech, my First Amendment lawyer hat on, gets removed. During the period in which Trump was basically deplatformed, there were a couple of legit accounts that did get swept up. And it's important to kind of keep that part of it in mind. But for the most part, what we actually have seen data-wise is that the removal of several dozen accounts helped contribute to a reduction by 73% of misinformation on Twitter in the days after Trump and allies were removed. And that on COVID, there are about 111 super spreaders of the worst mis and disinformation. So there's sort of this like very concentrated set of people and accounts that are doing the most harm. And so removal could very well be it feels somehow like we can think that removal would be the right step. The reduction of visibility, I think, is another one we have to kind of consider, and that right now, the platforms give us no data or visibility into what people are seeing. We have no idea the impressions of content on platforms, like none. I see Nancy smiling because this is where
I didn't tell you to say that, but you're saying what
and this is the part that I find. I don't think transparency will be the silver bullet, just like I don't think media literacy will be the silver bullet, but they are both layers and elements of the solution. And the fact that, right now these platforms have given us no access, in Sunshine Week in particular, we should call it out, it's so damning to them. And it creates a problem where our own vision for how we can call for accountability is completely blunted. And then I think the final piece of informing users is one of the most exciting, in my opinion, because it could actually begin shifting how we think of accountability. If platforms, sort of to Alex's point, were to begin to shift where they place value, and that we might begin thinking about an online internet system where people come to it to learn, to be engaged with each other, to be informed. And so I just wanted to add my 2 cents about how I think of those, kind of the breakdown of the various ways the platforms currently categorize what they can do.
Well, I love your tying not just the transparency and to the Sunshine Week, but about how this is, because it relates to a question that someone asked that we didn't get to yet, which was talking about, what do you do about the stories that don't get told and how that could contribute to our misinformation? And I would say that this lack of transparency on the platforms is actually a piece of that. I always like to use the analogy of, people look for the keys under the spotlight because, the spotlight's there and they're drunk and they can't think to look anywhere else. So, Twitter is actually, you see a lot of analyses and reports and studies about how information travels on Twitter, because Twitter's been actually pretty more open about the data it releases on what flows on Twitter than some of the other platforms. And then you have a whole series of platform policies that are more or less transparent. So, for example, with Facebook, they have a library of political ads on the platform, and they release a bunch of information about that, which is great, but they do not release the targeting information,
right,
which is really crucial to understanding, why these ads were placed by the advertisers. And, so there's certain crucial pieces of the story that are missing. I don't know that that's actually what the questioner really meant. I think, there is also, I think what they were maybe referring to is just that, because of social media, we tend to kind of, there's another element too, right? Like where we all kind of go and look over here because that's what people are talking about that moment, when all this stuff is happening over there, that, is traditionally the role of the media to report. The media, of course, is being, the way people are increasingly encountering it is on social media. So that's a whole other big mess that we haven't even really touched on yet. But what about the stuff? What are we not, when we concentrate so much on social media, what are we missing?
I mean, social media is everything, right? It's like, no, I mean, I say that a little, a little bit jokingly, but for people who are under, I don't know, 18, are they, going to the NewYorkTimes.com or turning on NPR? They're probably not. They're spending a lot of time on TikTok and Snapchat, not on Twitter or Facebook if they're under 18, more likely than not, unless they're an influencer, maybe Instagram. So I think it's amazing to think that Facebook is I think Facebook is less than 20 years old, if I'm not mistaken, or it's maybe just going to turn 20. So it's something that didn't exist in the year 2000 for all intents and purposes, now dominates our lives or has such influence or impact in our lives. It's hard to imagine it, but Facebook, and I would have probably argued Twitter, has more reach than probably the top 5 newspapers, and certainly all 3 nightly news broadcasts combined. So these platforms, which have crept into existence and taken over how we communicate. I mean, how often do we actually call each other? Or we're DMing, we're sending, commenting on each other. But how often do we call each other using actual telephones? It's hard to, especially for the younger segment of our society. It's hard to overestimate the central role that social media is playing. So we're playing catch up, and obviously now even in Colorado, there are these bills that are talking about regulation. There are bills that are talking about mandating the teaching of media literacy in classrooms. We're trying to catch up, and that's always the way it goes, right? Some new technology gets invented, and we're trying to figure out how to regulate it and how to mitigate, if it is impacting society, how to mitigate those harms. And it's going to take us a while to figure it out. And there are countries, Malaysia, I think this week or last week, passed a law banning fake news. I don't think that's going to solve the fake news problem in Malaysia, but we're struggling, right? We're experimenting with these things and trying to figure out, like, okay, there's a problem. How do we solve it? Let's pass a law, see if that works. Okay, now we need to tweak the law, or let's not pass a law because that would be too heavy-handed.
One of the commenters questioned early on, about this media literacy bill in Colorado, which was filibustered essentially last week. Why is this issue so polarizing? How are we going to get anywhere if people, are going to, it becomes a political football like that? No one wants to answer that.
I mean, I'm happy to give my thoughts, but maybe Nora wants to chime in on this.
Well, I was in a setting like this recently, and I described January 6th, the events of the siege on the Capitol. And someone confronted me about that and said that I was essentially promoting conspiracy theories, and they promoted the big lie, that Trump, in fact, had won the election, and that it had been a necessary thing for some random people to investigate what was going on in Congress. And that there, was sort of just no intent. No one knew anything. It was just a couple dudes. And the question, Nancy, is impossible to answer, I think, is the real truth, because the underpinning is that so many factions now of our American public and other people around the world fall for and now live their lives based on false narratives and, make assumptions, behavioral choices, voting preferences based on those lies that have been sown over many years. So coming to something like, let's say, an issue of, could we implement media literacy in schools? I actually think that's a tremendous idea. How would we go about doing it? I'm not sure. I don't have the solution alone. But people then feel that if we say we're trying to implement something around truth, it becomes very polarizing. And I don't have the answer, is the real truth. I think it's truly the existential question facing us. And it's very hard.
Right. So there's a bunch of questions about bias, actually. And I think that's an interesting question because we throw around a lot of terms, bias, truth. There's some tools out there that help you rate the bias of different news organizations, for example. Others say, okay, we know what Damaso thinks of those. Other people say that bias is less important than truth, that truth is, because you can be biased, but true, et cetera. Maybe talk about that a little bit. I tend to think that bias doesn't, well, anyway, maybe I don't want to talk about what I think. I want to hear what you think.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking the tough questions. Also within the concept, I think, of sort of American journalism, we're having these debates about objectivity and fairness and truth. And, I like to talk about facts because, facts are things that can be measured. They can be sort of objectively understood. And unfortunately, over not just the past 4 years, but I would say the past few decades, it's societally, and not just America, have gotten away from facts being at the core, right? Like, let's think about what these facts are, and then we can debate, like, okay, how do we interpret these facts? And if we can come to a consensus about facts, then that becomes truth, right? But truth isn't the same as facts. Truth is an interpretation of facts. And truth is a thing, like it can exist, but different people can have different truths. I don't think different people should have different facts, right? If I walk out the door and I say it's 70 degrees, well, I can take my thermometer, you can take your thermometer, we can measure it. If I walk out the door and say it's hot, that's certainly going to be my truth, but it might not be your truth depending on your perspective and where you're from. So, within, I think, the journalism community, we need to be more transparent. We need to talk about biases. We need to talk about our perspectives, and we need to talk about how we come to conclusions, right? When I was a younger journalist, I like to think I'm still somewhat young. It was essentially, trust me, I'm a journalist, right? Like, I wouldn't lie to you. Why would I lie to you? Like, my credibility is everything. That doesn't cut it anymore. Right? I have to show my homework. I have to explain, like, here's how I did this. Here's who I talked to. Here's how in order to convince people to trust me rather than some anonymous guy on Twitter or Clubhouse now who's giving their perspective, which might be more appealing to me. But these are not easy things to talk about. Like, there's multiple generations of journalists who have been trained to never talk about what they think or how they feel, lest someone accuse them of being biased. And now we have Twitter, and there are lots of journalists on Twitter being like, this is what I think, and this is how I feel. Does that mean that the journalism they produce is unfair or biased? Those are two very different things, right? Journalists have always had opinions. we'd get together at the bar after covering the mayor, and somebody would say, oh, that guy's a real jerk, or oh no, he's a really good guy. We always have had feelings. The question is, do we let our feelings unfairly impact the work that we do? And we have lots of safeguards, hopefully, to prevent that from happening, which the public generally never knew anything about, right? So now they see a prominent journalist on Twitter spouting off about something, and then they say, oh, well, that means that the radio piece they produce or the front page article means there's no way they can be fair to that politician, that ethnic group, that fill in the blank. And so we're all struggling with this right now, both as audience and as content producers, as journalists, fill in the blank.
Right, and we did get a question earlier on about, don't we need to educate the public about the difference between a journalist and someone who's a blogger or, that sort of thing? Where does that fit in? Where does the role of the, traditional media fit into all of this when everyone's a content creator?
I mean,
I'll jump in.
Please jump.
I'm like, I see Damaso like, I guess I'll sort of answer all of it because it's all very closely connected. I mean, the question around bias and authorship and, how we assess what we're seeing is all tied up with what we believe. So, yes, we should be helping people understand what they see. In our trainings on media literacy at PEN America, part of what we begin with is just sort of showing people some of the stats on how people get news. And a majority of American adults now use social media as their gateway to news. They're not going to, the Fox News or the New York Times or a local paper. They're not, getting it delivered, frankly. They're going to Facebook and they're seeing Nancy's post or Damaso's post. And frankly, I think a lot of people aren't even then clicking on things. They just sort of see the headline and then base a lot of their assumptions. So understanding that you might be seeing an op-ed versus someone's random blog post versus a talk radio piece or the transcription of a radio interview. There are so many ways to begin just unpacking your own experience. And that's part of what is sort of baked into how you become more media literate. I do think that the question around trust in the media, though, is one we've been dancing around. And it feels like, there are very legitimate reasons that communities distrust the media. And when we think about what has happened, let's take the racial justice protests last summer, and that there were instances in which some tremendous writing was done. Black journalists said, what has been happening where large mainstream media has helped promote a kind of narrative that does not shine a light, is not accountable to larger social justice questions and equity. And that has then, of course, sort of, I think, created a little crack to have the conversation now with media about what does bias look like and fairness? And then how do you balance that with the kinds of things that journalists might now be wanting to talk about and wanting to do in their work, where they call things out, where they are focusing on a spotlight on different elements of a story. The shooting in Atlanta, so many people said the media got that wrong. Why were they titling a headline that, white man had a bad day and goes on a rampage versus there were 8, victims and detailing sort of what their stories were. I think those are great questions that the media is now asking. And I think a lot of journalists of color are leading that movement. And I am really excited about it. I think it is an element now that layers on top of all of the sort of digital questions here, because one of the solutions and inoculations to disinformation is being able to turn to credible journalism. So the kind of work that, everyone here tonight and the awardees that we saw, the work they are doing are in many ways the antidote or a piece of the antidote to when we otherwise would kind of turn to junk content. When communities are misinformed And when there is less local news, they are going to be more vulnerable to the kinds of misleading narratives that ultimately lead us to where we are. So I think that, the digital realm and then sort of the local news angle, they're incredibly linked. And it's an exciting time actually to be talking about how they are.
Right. And, I'll throw in, we're getting close to the end, I'll throw in a pitch kind of more to the technology and engineering piece again. Some people may be familiar, there's a national outlet called The Markup, whose mission is to report on social media platforms, to show, really do investigative stories about how algorithms work, and they work unfairly, whether it's, the way ads discriminate, say, or the way there's scams where people are drawn in through, kind of the mechanisms of how the algorithms work to be bilked out of their money. Doing the kind of reporting around political advertising and how it works, or other misleading advertising. So I would just do a shout out. It's a personal thing of mine, I guess, too, that there's some accountability reporting to do about the platforms and how they work that we're just beginning to see. There's some folks that are doing really great jobs. There's a lot of room to do that at the local level. And I think, seeing it in that way, not just as solely a business story and solely as a misinformation and, content story, but how do these companies work? What do we get from them? It will help in the education process. So that's my little soapbox. Alex, do you have anything to add? You've been quiet for a little while and we're coming on to the half hour.
I think that's a great idea. That is someone, pretty deep in software engineering and computer science. That's actually much harder. I like the idea and I want to do it. It's very hard to do that, to figure out how to, I'm not even sure what it means to share the algorithm. I'm a big fan of transparency, and I think it's pretty clear I'm not an apologist for these companies. I think they have serious work to do and really need to start by admitting the consequences that these platforms that they built have on society. It's not clear to me though what it means or how to take the algorithm and publish it to the world.
Mm-hmm.
These are very complicated things. In many cases, they're these learned models that actually we don't even know how they work as the inventors of them. They learn based on data, which sounds like an absurd thing to say until you think of like a child acquiring knowledge. I mean, no one can explain how a child tells the difference between a dog and a car, but we know they all do it. And we know that they sort of learn it by looking at a lot of data and getting some inputs from their parents. But if you said like, we don't believe this is right, we have to explain what it's actually doing internally to make that classification, we don't know how to do it. And so
right.
I'm not sure the most fruitful way is to more transparency on the inners of the algorithm, only not because I don't think it's a good idea. I just think it's very, very difficult to figure out the way to
one
do it.
project, you can't, it's a huge universe, just like reporting on the, lots of things is a huge universe. But for example, a project the Markup has is something called Citizen Browser, where because of the very nature of how Facebook works, you can't tell what's on someone's feed. Only the person themselves can tell what's on someone's feed. So it's actually a project where they recruit a survey panel of folks who, share with the Markup the information they see on Facebook so they can then analyze it. They did some stories, for example, in the lead up to the Georgia primary that showed that extremist content and polarizing content increased based on that factual collection of information. So that's just one practical example.
Yeah.
Another great example is highlighted in The Social Dilemma. The example, if you type in climate change, and some people will say, you'll get like ways to mitigate it, and other people will get auto completions like is a hoax.
Exactly.
And highlighting, like having people type the same thing into both of their search bars, or opening up your Facebook feed side by side. You can certainly inspect the algorithm. It's hard to describe what it's doing.
Well, and I think there can be more explanation. I think there was a really good article in the New York Times last week talking about the challenge of ethical AI. But even, you mentioned, Alex, well, these things learn by data. What are the data sets, right? There was an infamous example of Google images misclassifying someone's Black friends and putting all their Black friends in the gorilla folder, right? Because the data set that the AI was trained on, primarily had white people. Who were the engineers? Like, what's the diversity numbers on that? Like, there are ways in which we can at least open up some of it. Like, I don't want to read a bunch of code. Like, that's not how I get my jollies. But there are ways, I think, when the engineers are sitting in the room and they say, hey, we want this to be the outcome. Okay, say that. Like, we want this to be outcome. We want to prioritize this versus this, right? Even doing simple things like that at a level of transparency that most users have no idea exists, in the same way that journalists need to be more transparent. When there's a non-trivial number of people out there who think that when I write an anonymous source told me, that I don't know who the source is, right? And as a journalist, like, I think everybody knows what an anonymous source is. No, they don't. Like, I actually have to do a better job of explaining it. So I think there's probably even some basic things that engineers think, oh yeah, everybody kind of understands that. No, like, it's a completely opaque. I type in Google and something happens. Like, even doing the simplest explainer can help us better understand. And then when things shift, like, oh, we decided to deprioritize this and prioritize that, those are great ways to engage the public.
That's 100% true. And the example for my life, the number of people that have come up to me after watching that movie and saying, like, I had no idea how any of this stuff worked or what was going on. It was like eye-opening. And it's the same thing to me. I'm like, well, of course, everyone knows we're optimizing for getting people to use the product more, because that's why the companies don't die. In the same way that you think, of course, everyone knows anonymous means not anonymous to you. You spoke to the person. So yeah, I think there's some basic education we could do that, will probably get us pretty far, to be honest. And we won't know unless we try it. So let's try that.
Yeah. Well, let's try that. Seems like a great way to end this evening's discussion. I know it's 8:30. We've been on for a long while, and we could continue talking forever, and it would be fun to do it sometime in person, as opposed to from my basement. But I just want to thank each and every one of you. So incredible and giving so much time. And again, put a pitch to support the organization Colorado Freedom of Information Coalition that works so hard for media organizations and the public throughout the state, and brought to us this discussion. I see the esteemed leader of Colorado Freedom of Information Coalition is lurking there. So I will turn it back over to him.
Oh, and I just wanted to thank you all once again for such a fascinating discussion. This was great, and we will post the video on our website for those who missed it. But what a great discussion tonight, and thank you all so much, and Nancy for leading this. This was terrific. I also wanted to just once again point people to our website, coloradofoic.org. We're working every day on freedom of information issues in Colorado, and please consider supporting us.